Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, August 17th, 2006. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. With this week, Chris Colby from Brew Your Own magazine joins us to talk about extract home brewing strategies. Say you've got a smaller brew pot and a stovetop, what's the best way to go about making great beer? I'm posting a little early this week because of my work schedule, so I hope you enjoy the early posting. No extra charge, by the way. Let's take a look into the mailbag. Brian from Marquette, Michigan writes, a friend of mine was out picking thimbleberries for a lambic beer that he's been wanting to brew, and he stumbled across some wild hops. He showed up at my door holding some in his hand, and we were excited to go and get some more of them so we could use them to brew with. We started thinking of all the unknowns about these hops, and now we were wondering if it's too risky to try and use them in a beer. We have no idea how strong in alpha acids these hops are or what ratio you would use fresh hops compared to dried hops. Do you know any hop experts that could put us at ease about what to do with these? We're thinking of doing just a 5-gallon experiment batch to try to get our heads around what these hops will do to a beer. We want to split the 5-gallon batch into 2.5-gallon batches and add a lot of bittering hops to one with less flavor and aroma hops, and do the other half with light bittering hops and heavy flavor and aroma hops, so we can sort of separate those aspects to get a good idea of what we have. Brian says, I thought I would ask you because maybe you've come across the question before. Well, Brian, I may not be a hop expert myself, but I can tell you what I just did with my own homegrown hops and what hop experts have told us on this show in past episodes. I got a rhizome. You may remember I got a rhizome of Cascade hops from Dave Wills up at Fresh Hops a few months ago. And a couple of weeks ago, my family and I picked almost 2 pounds of fresh hops from my hop vines. Incredible. I didn't expect anywhere near that volume of hops. Now, I may have been jumping the gun a little bit in picking at that time, but it was a choice between picking the hops a little early and watching them burn to a crisp in the Arkansas sun. So I couldn't stand to watch all those hops just burn up. So we picked them maybe a little early, but I think we would have wound up with no hops if we hadn't. Now, if you'll remember our conversation with Matt and Tess Samatulski on hops, they recommended using homegrown hops for flavoring and aroma and using commercial hops for bittering, since you can't be sure what alpha acid content is on the homegrown hops. And I think this probably applies to those wild hops that you found, Brian. So that's the strategy that I used in making my homegrown Harvest Ale. When I brewed it a few days ago, I used an ounce of commercial Cascade pellets to lay down a base of bitterness, because that's a known quantity. I knew what the alpha acids were on that. Then I used my homegrown hops for flavoring, aroma, and even dry hopping. If you'll also remember from that conversation with Matt and Tess, they said you need to use around 3 times as much fresh hops by weight because of the weight of the water that's still in the hops. When the hops are dried, they lose a lot of moisture and therefore a lot of weight. So you need to use about 3 times as much, or maybe I've read some sources say even more, fresh hops than you would dried hops. And you can learn a bit about the character of your wild hops by just doing a hop rub before you use them. Take a few cones and rub them between the palms of your hands. And as you rub them, the lupulin glands will break, and the heat of the friction between your hands will release some of the aromas. So you won't be able to get an accurate picture of the bitterness potential or the alpha acid content, but you will be able to get an idea of the character, the flavor, and possibly the flavor, definitely the aroma coming out of those hops. So do a hop rub to see what these wild hops smell like, and use them in small batches for flavor and aroma, and you might even use them in even smaller batches than the 2.5 gallons that you're planning. You could even go a gallon and play with using them in bitterness and aroma and flavor, and just kind of testing them out before you move on to bigger batches. Use 3 times as much by weight as you would with dry hops. And, if you want to be more adventurous, you can try to use them as bittering hops. But keep in mind that unless you have access to a lab, you don't know their bitterness potential. So good luck with that, Brian, and let us know how your experiments come out. By the way, Brian also had input for Matt from Lewiston, Maine, if you'll remember, who wrote in last week asking for suggestions of beers that his non-beer-loving fiancé might enjoy. Brian says, I really understand where he's coming from. I just made a Belgian wit beer. It's a Hoegaarden clone from the Beer Captured book, coincidentally, by Matt and Tess Samatulski, by the way. And Brian says it went over very well, even with people who are not beer drinkers, in quotes. And he said that would be a good one to try. Good advice. That Belgian wit style is a good style with some interesting flavor characteristics, and it's not too bitter, which may scare some non-beer people away. They're not non-people just because they do. Slip of the tongue there, Freudian slip. You don't want to scare your non-beer people away with too much bitterness, especially at first. By the way, Matt wrote in again saying, my fiancé thinks I made the situation sound worse than it was in the email, but it gave us a good laugh. Well, that's good. It's good she's got a good sense of humor. I'm anxious to hear any other suggestions, Matt says. I did try a float in a stout, and it was very good, but she didn't want to try it that day. She was on her way to bed at the time. So it's all about the timing. But Matt has another good question. He says, this time of year it's very warm around here. We just finished a 2-week heat wave with temperatures from 90 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's about 32 to 38 degrees Celsius, by the way. The coolest location in my home was around 80 degrees at one point, or around 27 C. Purchasing a refrigerator for brewing is not an option. Would you be able to do a show or at least know where to get answers on how to either cope with warm temperatures or have recipes suitable for warm weather? Are there any yeast strains better suited for these temperatures? Well, we've talked about this on the show before, and Matt, I know what you mean. I'm lucky personally in that I have a little basement that's at around 68 degrees Fahrenheit right now. That's about 20 C. But if you don't have a basement, what do? And we've talked about it on the show before, as I said, and brewers have written in with methods like putting your carboy in a tub of water, putting a wet T-shirt over that carboy, and letting evaporation cool the beer a few degrees. You know, as the water evaporates, more water from the tub is drawn into the shirt to replace the water that evaporates. You can also use a fan to blow on that setup there to increase your evaporation. Others put their fermenters in tubs or coolers of water and put ice or frozen plastic bottles in there. The handy thing with the bottles is that you can replace them with fresh ones as the bottles melt and put the melted ones back in the freezer. Now, I recently bought a 10-gallon cylindrical water cooler for a lagering experiment I'm planning, and I found that I could get a 5-gallon carboy in there or a 5-gallon plastic bucket. And when I had my Belgian blonde that I wanted to crash the yeast out of, I put a 5-gallon carboy in there, covered it with ice, and I was able to get it near freezing in that setup. Now, a lot of brewers, and by the way, you can also use that cylindrical water cooler, the 10-gallon water cooler, as a mash tun, if you want to. A lot of brewers switch to brewing Belgians in the summer because the Belgian yeast strains are more tolerant to warm fermentation temperatures. But if you listen to the interview I did with Stan Hieronymus, author of Brew Like a Monk, he advises that you start even Belgian fermentations cool and then let them warm up naturally as the fermentations progress. So you may want to start the fermentation using one of the cooling methods that I just talked about, then let nature kind of take its course over time and warm those fermentations up so you get some of those traditional Belgian flavors from that yeast. Another tactic to battling the heat would be to brew smaller batches in the summertime. It may be easier to maintain the temperature of those smaller volumes of wort or beer. And then, of course, when fall comes around, you just brew like a madman before we have to worry about dealing with temperatures that are too cold to ferment comfortably. Now, of course, south of the equator, it's already wintertime down there, and it's been wintertime, and many brewers are feeling the opposite, or fighting the opposite battle, waiting for spring. But, would brewing be as fun if it were easy? Maybe. Possibly. Probably. I don't know. Couple of reminders for you. Talking about hops and Dave Wills earlier. If you go to hopmadness.com and you live up in the northwest part of the country or want to travel to the northwest part of the country, they have an event up there where they harvest the hops, and they have a camp out, and they have brewing, home brewing out in the hop fields. And Dave Wills says it's madness. It's hop madness. So go to hopmadness.com to find out more about that event, and that's coming up here pretty quick. And another reminder, brewing season is coming up, so if you wanted to get into all-grain brewing, if you're looking to get into all-grain brewing, now's the time to order your copy of our Stepping into All Grain DVD from basicbrewing.com. Order it now so you'll be up to speed when the weather moderates. So you can get your gear all together, watch the DVD a couple times, get your system all thought out, and then when it's cooler, you can spend some time outside on the patio brewing, you'll be all ready to go. Just a little reminder there. Now, let's get on with our interview with Chris Colby, editor of Brew Your Own magazine. Over the past few weeks, we've tackled some advanced topics on the show, thanks to the experts at the Homebrewers Conference. So let's get back to basics with Chris. We talked to Chris about his favorite strategies for making a split batch extract brew. Well, Chris Colby, welcome again to Basic Brewing Radio.
How's it going?
It's going good. It's been a while since we talked. All this National Homebrewers Conference stuff kind of pushed you into the background for a little bit, and I apologize for that.
No sweat at all. Hope you had fun at the conference.
Oh, it was a blast, and lots of good information and lots of good homebrew.
Yeah, I've been to a couple of them. It's good to be in a room full of just hundreds of homebrewers. There's something really nice about that. And
as a journalist, everywhere you turned, you could point the mic in any direction and have a good interview. So, plenty of low-hanging fruit there, so to speak. I don't know if homebrewers would like to be referred to as low-hanging fruit, but there you go. Well, I got my, and we're recording this a few days before this is to run, but I got my issue of my September issue of Brew Your Own today, and I haven't dug into it all the way yet. But on the cover is one of the heroes, the current heroes of the craft brewing industry, Sam Calagione from Dogfish.
Yeah, Sam's helped us out on a couple things over the years. We did a story not too long ago on building a Randall, like a hop filter that you push the beer out of the keg through the hops and then serve it. And he helped us out on this article on a little collection of beer recipes he came up with.
Now, what are the recipes? Do you remember them offhand? They can't be run-of-the-mill recipes from Sam.
No. Yeah, the title of the article is Extreme Beer Recipes, or I think 5 extreme beer recipes. And what they are is they're all just beers with an unusual ingredient in them, or ones that are unusually full of the normal beer ingredients.
Now, are these ingredients that everybody can get their hands on easily?
Yeah, they're pretty standard ingredients. There's I'm just looking quickly at this. There's a triple with some chamomile in it. There's a wit beer with a kiwi. There's a peppercorn rye bock with peppercorns, which are widely available. Molasses Marzen. What's the last one? Another one with a lot of different kinds of sugar, some Demerara sugar in it, which isn't that hard to find. And I believe they're also setting up a website where you can order the ingredients for these recipes through Sam. Oh, wow.
Well, that's handy. And also, another article caught my eye because it kind of connects with an email that I got the other day. You've got an article in the back of the magazine on how to can wort for use with starters.
Yeah, we've got the idea here is basically that you use the same kind of canning procedures that you would use in-home food preservation, like if you had a garden and you were, canning your beans or carrots or whatever. But you would can wort to then use, just be a ready yeast starter. The advantages of it are once you can it, you seal it. It should be sterilized if you do the canning procedure right. And you store the wort at room temperature. So really all you have to do is, open it up, throw it in a sanitized wort starter vessel and aerate, throw some yeast in, and you're good to go.
And if you're an all-grain purist, you're not using extract to make your starters. You're using your wort that you made in your mash tun.
That's one way you can do it. I mean, that's one way some brewers do it. If they're brewing, say a 10-gallon batch of all-grain beer, they'll make 11 gallons or 12 gallons, and 10 of it will go to the batch they're brewing, and a couple other gallons will run off for yeast starters. You can do it either way. I think the article, actually I know the article talks about doing it from extract, but it's the same exact deal. If you have some extra wort from your brew day, you can follow the procedures here, same as you would if you boiled up some extract.
You can tell that I haven't read the article yet, so I
should be a little bit more sure about what it is, given that I just edited it like a week ago, and already I can't remember.
Well, the reason I brought that article up is I got an email from Kevin in Port Elizabeth, South Africa, and he was listening to an episode from last year where Casey from Siloam Springs was making an all-grain starter in a French press coffee maker. He made just this tiny all-grain batch just to make a starter. Mm-hmm. But Kevin says, he suggests increasing your grain bill slightly, and then when collecting into the fermenter, run a couple of liters into sanitized PET bottles. Oh, he's running into the fermenter, so maybe he's been through the boil. So we talked a little bit about this before we started recording, so this may change your answer a little bit.
Yeah, if it's boiled, that's a little better. Before we were talking about if it was ran off straight from the mash.
Right. He says he uses either 500 milliliters or 2-liter PET Coke bottles. He seals it up and sticks it in a deep freeze to be defrosted when you need to make a starter. Although it should be sterile, I normally boil it again before making up the starter and never had any problems. So, yeah, that teaches me again. I'm not well prepared, Chris. I'm spoiled because this is the first interview that I've done in a few weeks after being at the Homebrew Conference and having all those interviews in the can. So, I'm shaking the cobwebs out. But so what Kevin does is he makes a bit more wort than he needs, and as he's collecting into the fermenter, he runs some off into sanitized bottles and freezes it, and then brings it out, thaws it, and then boils it again just to be safe, and then makes starters with that. So what do you think about that?
Here's the one caution I would have, and this is something we get into in the article. Botulism, which is a bacteria, Clostridium botulinum, can grow in foods when the pH is above 4.6. This bacteria is actually everywhere in our environment, and it's actually found in honey, which is why you're not supposed to give little kids honey. But anyway, when in home food preservation, for like people who can, they divide up their canning rituals into when they can high acid foods and when they can low acid foods. High acid foods, where the pH is below 4.6, they most often use the boiling water method, where they fill the cans, they submerge them under boiling water for like 15 minutes or so, or 30 minutes, and then seal them up, and that's usually good enough to sterilize it. But for low acid foods, where the pH is actually above 4.6, they do pretty much the same thing, except they do it in a pressure cooker, which means the temperature that the water is boiling at is elevated, around 240 degrees. And the thing with wort is that wort has a pH of about 5 to 5.2 after the boil, so that would be a low-acid liquid. So the thing about storing, and I mean, on the one hand, we all boil wort and then ferment it, and things turn out fine. But that's because the yeast takes over relatively rapidly. The pH drops. Normal beer drops to a pH of 4 to 4.4, somewhere in that range. and pretty quickly takes over before any botulism could set in. But if you're storing just plain old wort that's not been fermented, it's going to remain at that high pH. There's going to be like no alcohol to fend off the botulism. It's the kind of thing that I think it would be a low risk, because even though spores of botulism are everywhere, they don't, in the U.S. they don't really amount to, and in other places, there aren't a lot of like canning disasters where people get really sick and die. I mean, that happens, but it's not really widespread. But so that would be the only thing I'd say. I'd say there's a little bit of a risk in storing just plain boiled wort. On the other hand, I know tons of homebrewers who do exactly that same thing. And I mean, I've done it in the fridge for a couple of weeks, and it's just something to be aware of. Certainly, if you store something, if you boil some wort, store it in a fridge or freezer, and something looks suspect about it, like something was growing in it, I would definitely not bother with that wort, because reboiling it won't help you at that point.
And certainly, if there's any bulging or if the container is split for some reason, it's kind of like a bulging can of food.
Right.
You want to throw those away.
Any of the warning signs that your mom taught you when you're buying cans of food, if they look like they're bulging, or if there's I don't suppose you'd be storing metal or wort in a metal container, but they always tell you if the can's dented severely, that can be a sign, because it can be an entrance into the can for botulism. But
so there you go. Always err on the side of safety.
Yeah, I would. I mean, it's like I say, a lot of homebrewers do something like that, where they boil up wort and save it. I've actually got, while I'm giving this warning, I've got 4 little things of wort sitting in my freezer right now. So
so do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah, listen to my warnings, but don't look at what I'm doing in my home brewery.
Okay, with the meat of our conversation, you wrote an article called "Extract Method to Your Madness," and you walk us through some common methods of doing extract brewing. And it's been a while since we talked about extract brewing, so I wanted to kind of walk through those. And you start with the simplest, which is no boil brewing.
Yeah, no boil brewing is a lot of the kits as they originally came out, the old can of extract, and then they told you to add a kilo of sugar. A lot of those were, the instructions that came with them were for no boil procedures. You'd heat up some water to about 160, 170, somewhere in there. Just stir the sugars in and the extract in. Let it sit for 15 minutes to sanitize it. As long as it's above like 160, it's above pasteurization temperature, and then you just cool it down and pitch your yeast and go. So yeah, that was one of the methods that we mentioned. It's very easy, but it also, the downside of course is that whatever beer you get, the recipe has been completely dictated by the kit manufacturer. And
these are hopped malt extracts.
Yeah, there's both hopped and unhopped, but obviously if you're doing it that way, you're going to have to go with the hopped, because otherwise you'll have beer with no bitterness whatsoever.
I guess before we get too much further, we ought to explain or remind the listeners what extract is. What is malt extract?
Yeah, malt extract is just basically condensed wort. Malt extract brewers or manufacturers go through a mash where they take crushed grains, steep it in hot water, just like a all-grain brewer when making a full mash beer. That's run off, boiled, and then it's either boiled under a vacuum to condense it into liquid malt extract, or it's sprayed into a room that's basically evacuated. It's a vacuum, and I think it's also heated. I'm not really so sure on that, but anyway, they spray it into these rooms, and the droplets of malt wort fall to the floor, and by the time they get there, all the water has evaporated out of them, and they just fall to the floor of these chambers as dried malt extract.
And so when you're using extracts, like you said, you're kind of at the mercy of the brewer at the extract manufacturer, because it's their all-grain recipe, essentially, that you're reconstituting.
Right, a straight extract beer where you're not steeping your own specialty malts, you're not boiling your own hops. Yeah, you've either got to find one recipe that they've made that you like, or you've got to switch to another method.
But if you want to have your individuality, if you want to have more flexibility on your recipe, you can take your malt extract and an unhopped malt extract and add your own hops, and there's some ways that you suggest, methods that you suggest to do that. And the first one is the concentrated boil method. And I guess if you don't have a big brew pot to do a full boil, this is one method that you can use.
All the methods I talk about in this article are stovetop methods, so they all assume that you're boiling less volume of wort than the size of your batch. If you have a turkey fryer set up, one of those propane burners outside, and a pot that's 7 gallons or larger, you can boil your entire wort and do a full wort boil. But with all the recipes in this article, I'm assuming that you're boiling starting with about 3 gallons on your stovetop. And the first one I discussed, as you say, is the concentrated boil method, and that's the one that most of us grew up, doing, where you take, your malt extract, you dissolve it in a couple gallons, 2 or 3 gallons of water. You boil it. You probably have steeped specialty grains that you've added while the water was heating, and then you throw in hops as the boil progresses, and you make your beer from that. And the thing I point out in the article is that this method can be used successfully sort of for only a narrow range of beers. There are two big problems with this method, or two big sort of negative aspects of it. And one is that when you boil your wort at that sort of stronger concentration to be diluted later, it tends to darken a lot more than you would like. So you need to be brewing a beer. If you're going to use this technique, you need to be brewing a beer that's either amber or darker. Likewise, when you're boiling that thick of a wort, and also you're going to then dilute the wort later, you can't really build up a lot of hop bitterness that way. So you're stuck with sort of darkish, sweetish beers to brew with that method.
And that's because the utilization of the hops suffers greatly in heavy or dense volumes.
Right. If you, let's say you start out with 3 gallons of wort and you boil it down to 2.5 for a 5-gallon batch. You're boiling your wort, at the end, it's at twice the gravity of, your target original gravity. If you're brewing a beer that's like specific gravity is supposed to be 1.050, which is pretty much normal strength beer, you're boiling it at, 1.100, which is like at a barley wine strength.
Right.
So yeah, it's it's harder to boil the bitterness out of the hops at those heavier, thicker concentrations. And then you're also faced with the fact that you're diluting it after that even if you did get 100 IBUs of bitterness out of it, which you would be hard-pressed to do, once you dilute it by half, you'd be down to 50.
To make a barley wine in a split boil, it's near impossible, I would think. I mean, you'd be boiling syrup. Yeah. Any time when you dilute the wort at the end of the boil, it's really hard to make a very hoppy beer. Now, how do you get around that? I mean, how do you get around? Say, if you're an extract brewer and you've got a brew pot and a home stove set up, and you don't have the setup to have a full boil, how do you get around that?
Well, there's two ways. There's sort of a partial way around it, and then there's a full way around it. The partial way around it is to use a method that we call the extract late method. That's where you, at the beginning of the boil, you add only a small amount of extract to the wort you've made from steeping your specialty grains. You add maybe, in most BYO recipes, we usually add about half the total extract because you're boiling in half the total volume. But you can even go less than that. The upshot of that is you're boiling a wort that's not very thick. You're boiling a wort essentially at working strength of your beer. And so you can get quite a bit, or you can get just as much hop bitterness out as a full wort boil. And then your only limitation is the fact that you're diluting it later, which, of course, puts you below the level of full wort boil. The second way to do it is to do a full wort boil, but in shifts. You do it, and this is a method that I call the Texas two-step, just because it has 2 steps to it.
And you're in Texas.
And I'm from Texas, yeah. So it seemed like a good thing at the time. But the idea is you would you just split all your ingredients down the middle for a batch of very hoppy beer, and one day or one evening you'd brew 2.5 gallons that you boil, the entire wort, cool it down, put it in your fermenter, pitch it. Then the next day, boil up another 2.5 gallons of the same hoppy wort, add it to the already fermenting wort from the day before, and you've got a beer that you've boiled. You've boiled every bit of wort that's, in your fermenter. And so the upshot of this is that, at least theoretically, you can brew beer that's twice as hoppy as other kinds of stovetop beers because you're not diluting it. The downside is, though, that you're putting twice as much work into it. You need essentially 2 little brew days to make your beer rather than one.
Of course, another way around that is to just make smaller batches.
You could do that, too.
We've done as small as a 6-pack batch. I do Google searches around the Internet for references to our podcast, and it's been interesting to kind of eavesdrop on online discussions about these things. Some people really get into the theory of making really small batches of beer because they can experiment, they can try out new things, new recipes, new styles that they haven't done before, and they can not invest a whole lot of money in doing that. And the time is less because it takes a smaller amount of time, a shorter amount of time to bring a smaller volume of wort up to boil.
Right.
And then it takes
less time to cool.
Time to cool.
Also, if you're pitching from a tube of White Labs yeast or a package of a smack pack of Y yeast, if you're making a smaller batch without a starter, your pitching rate automatically increases.
Ah, there you go.
Because you're getting about 100 billion cells in there, and if you're making 2.5 gallons or less, you're pretty much in the optimal pitching rate.
And you can always, if it's a moderate gravity beer, you could reuse the yeast from that primary fermentation for another batch of beer or a bigger batch of beer. So there's some advantages to think about. People on the other side of the fence say, why go to all that trouble just for a small volume of beer?
Right.
So I guess it's all in what you consider worth the effort and what you think is fun. Yeah,
I actually get at BYO I get letters on a fairly regular basis about people wanting to brew smaller batches, and the reasons vary from some people are just starting out and they want to brew 10 different kinds of beer, but they don't want to have 50 gallons of beer on hand. They want to be able to try something, drink a little bit of it, and go on to the next. And other people live in small apartments or whatever. As a graduate student, I always brewed 5-gallon batches, but in my apartment, that was actually taking up a ton of space.
Yeah.
I would have, had I thought of it at the time, it would have been better to buy a 3-gallon carboy or a 2-gallon carboy and, ferment the primary in a bucket, rack it over to the smaller carboy, and it would have been taking up less space, and I also probably could have done a full wort boil on my stove, and the pitching rate would have improved, although I was doing starters anyway, so that wouldn't have mattered. But yeah, there can be a lot of reasons for people scaling up or down.
Well, let me ask you on the extract late method, and we've talked a bit about this before, but why do you add a portion of the extract at the beginning of the boil with your bittering hops?
Well, if you boil hops in just plain water or even incredibly weak wort, you'll extract a lot of bitterness from them, but it'll be a really, really harsh, coarse kind of bitterness. And you'll likely get some vegetal kind of, planty notes to it. They really need to have the pH that you're boiling the hops at right around what normal wort pH is. And so you need the specific gravity to be over, and this is more of a guess than like any sort of scientific thing, but just from anecdotal evidence and some goofing around with doing it. But you need it at least over like 1.010, which is pretty weak. That's like fourth as strong as a dry stout. You just need enough malt extract in there so that the pH of the solution that you're boiling the hops in is going to end up in the 5 to 5.2 region.
So it's kind of a buffer.
Yeah.
Is there, if there are beginning home brewers out there who are not confident at measuring specific gravity, is there a guideline of a couple of cups and 2.5 gallons of water or 3 gallons of water? Or,
the easiest way to do it is assuming that you're going to be boiling starting with around 3 or 2.5 gallons, assuming that you're going to be boiling about half the amount of your wort, which is pretty standard. Just add half the amount of extract in your batch. It's not brain surgery. You can, if you're a little bit higher, a little bit lower. If you're trying to hit to the minimum, I don't know, it would be, what would it work out to be? About 1/4 pound of DME, I think, per gallon.
We'll have to do some experimenting.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I always just add about half, just because it's easy. And also you end up at the end, the less you add at the beginning, the more you have to add at the end. And when you add a ton at the end of the boil, especially if you're, need to boil it 15 more minutes, it just takes longer and longer to heat it back up.
Now, we, as you know, we did a couple experiments on doing very small batches and just boiling the bittering hops in plain water by themselves, and then adding the extract at 15 minutes before the end of the boil to get the sterilization. And the bitterness was, we did a side-by-side comparison, traditional and then this waiting to add the extract. And there was a difference in the bitterness. In our opinion, it wasn't an unpleasant bitterness. But that was a small batch, and we haven't done a full-scale test of it. So if you want to be safe, you can add that the recommended buffer of a bit of extract at the beginning of the boil.
Yeah, that would be, you'd be safer doing that. In some cases, also, if you depending on how much grains you're steeping, you might have the amount of wort you develop that way just from steeping might be enough at the beginning too. If you're steeping a couple pounds of malt at the beginning of your extract brew, that might get you up to the minimum point you need.
Now, if you've got half of your wort, you're done with the boil. What happens after that? I mean, let me get your opinion, because there's a couple of different schools of thought out there, and one of those schools of thought, and we've had emails about this, is that people put ice in their fermenters and then add their hot wort on top of 7 pounds of ice or something like that. What's your opinion of that method?
I'd be a little leery of that method for a couple reasons. The biggest would be sanitation. Ice can be, depending on how it was frozen, ice can harbor anything that's living in your freezer or on food that you've stored in your freezer. And so I'd worry a little bit about that. I mean, you could, if you boiled water and then put it into sanitized ice cubes and then covered them with foil or cling wrap or something and did it all that way, that might be a lot better.
But that's a lot of trouble.
The second criticism I would have, and this would be one that the brewer would just have to get out a thermometer and see if it's right or not, would be, I'm not sure if that would cool your wort all the way down. If you've got 2.5 gallons of just boiled wort, there's a lot of heat in there. I know a lot of people, they'll pour their hot wort, sometimes through a strainer even, into a bunch of cool water, and then they'll pitch their yeast. If you take the temperature of wort that way, you're still over 100 degrees at least, depending on how thick your wort is. So if you had enough ice, obviously you could cool it down. But
one concern that I have is I go to all the trouble to filter my water or buy spring water, and then if you buy commercial ice, say,
oh yeah,
that stuff's going to be full of chlorine, probably because it's probably city water that they've just frozen in these ice machines.
Yeah.
And so you're dumping this, half of a batch of beer that you've taken care to make properly, and you're dumping it onto God knows what.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. If you're using, store-bought ice, and then especially if you bought store-bought ice, I would be really worried about the sanitation issue. Because I know ice places don't make any effort to keep things clean to the level that you would expect in a brewery.
Yeah, I used to work in a restaurant when I was in high school, at an amusement park, and I could tell you a couple stories.
Yeah.
that would dissuade you from using commercial ice or ever going to a restaurant again. So
yeah. Oh yeah, I worked at a restaurant for a while too, and there was a while where I was like, yeah, I think I'll cook for myself tonight.
So what's your method? What is the best method that you think of once you've got that half of a boiled wort, then what?
Well, the best method is if you have a wort chiller. You have a submergible copper coil or a counterflow. That'll do the job very, very quickly. A lot of extract brewers, especially beginning extract brewers, maybe don't want to do it that way. Maybe haven't thought about that expense yet. But the second best way, and a way that I actually use a lot of times when I'm extract brewing, just because it's easier than getting out the wort chiller and cleaning it, is just cooling it in your sink or your bathtub. Put the pot in there, have a lid over it, fill the sink with cold water, stir it up, come back a couple minutes later, the wort or the water in the sink will be hot by then, drain it out, fill it with cold water again, and just cycle through that. You'll go through several cycles of filling the sink and letting the water heat up. When the side of the brew pot gets just basically cold enough that you can touch it, it's still hot, but it's not going to burn you, switch to adding some ice in the sink, and that should cool down the wort. Takes a little while to do, but not so long that it's a problem. You're not cooling it over any longer period than say commercial brewers do, and but it works well. It really helps to cool the wort first and then move it, I think, because another problem with say pouring it into hot wort, either into water or onto ice, is that when hot wort splashes around, it gets aerated, and it darkens on that, and it also sets up the sort of precursors for it to stale faster. But if you cool it first and then move it, you don't have to worry about that.
And what about the water that you use to make up the other half of the wort?
Yeah, I use tap water, but I have a under the sink filter. If you have good quality tap water and you can filter it with a carbon filter, you're in good shape. If not, maybe buying bottled water is the thing to do, or if you have a second fermentation bucket laying around, fill it with water the day before, throw in a Campden tablet, which is like a tablet they use for sanitizing wine, unfermented wine. Throw the Campden tablet in, cover it loosely, the bucket loosely with like tin foil, let it sit overnight. That'll drop all the chlorine out too, and sanitize the water. So with your water filter, is it good enough to get the bugs out? It mostly is. It's good. A filter should be good enough to get the bugs out. I mean, city water, your city water shouldn't have any bugs in it. I mean, if it does, there's something wrong with your city water. The usual problem with using just undiluted tap water, straight tap water in beer is either the chlorines or the chloramines that they add for city sanitation, and you want to get rid of those. Yeah, I've had on email discussions with brewers who are against sanitizing with bleach or a bleach solution because they don't want to rinse with tap water. Right. So there are brewers out there who are cautious even about tap water. So if you're that cautious, you probably ought to boil that half of the Some wort. People do that. They'll boil their rinse water the day before, put it in a sanitized bucket, and keep it. I think that's a little overkill. I mean, personally, I've never done that. I just use tap water straight out of my filter, and it seems to do the job. Especially if you pitch enough yeast, if you've made a yeast starter, or pitch a couple different tubes of yeast and aerate it well. I don't think, I think your water would have to be pretty contaminated before the time that became a problem. And you would probably know, due to those pains in your gut, that your water was in bad shape before you made bad beer. Yeah, I mean it would be on your local news not to drink your water before it got to the point that it would harm your brewing, I would think. Well, so what's the bottom line? What's the best method to do an extract beer? The best method depends on it depends on, as a brewer, how much time you're willing to put in and, what your quality goal is. Certainly, if you're trying to make a very hoppy beer and it has to be very hoppy for you, then you're going to need to do either a full wort boil or the Texas two-step. If you're brewing kind of a moderately hoppy beer, but you want it to be, light in color, the extract late version is one that works very well. If you look online these days and read what people are doing, it would be hard to tell, but it seems like that's the preferred method these days. It's as easy as the concentrated boil method, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't take any more time, and it gives better results. On the other hand, if you're, looking for just the, very easy method, and, you're brewing a beer that's a little bit darker and doesn't have a lot of hop bitterness, the concentrated boil method works well for, especially, there might even be some kind of beers where the sort of extra caramelization you get from boiling that thick wort might actually, add something to your beer. And then finally, if you just need to crank out something with alcohol in it and, spend the least amount of time, the no boil method might work.
If there is a hopped malt extract that you like out there, and you like what you get from the no boil method, then there's nothing wrong with that at all.
I've actually made a cranberry beer where I take hopped wheat extract, a little bit of honey. I do a no boil, wort to make the base beer, and then rack it onto cranberries a little bit later. I mean, I add enough cranberries to the beer that it's like a cranberry beer rather than a beer with cranberries. You don't taste much of the base beer. So I figure I'm not going to go through a whole all grain brew day to come up with this beer that I'm ending up not going to be tasting much. So there are ways or reasons that you might want to throw together a no boil batch on occasion.
And it's kind of like ramen noodles. If you get inventive enough, you could probably come up with some wonderful stuff.
Or as the base for a sour beer. I mean, a lot of people, if you're going to try to sour some wort, you might not feel like going through the whole rigmarole of an all-grain brew day when the sour is going to be the dominant flavor in your beer.
Well, very nice. It's good to talk to you again.
Nice talking to you. And
we'll talk to you again soon. When's the next issue coming out?
In the later part of the year, we switched to monthly, so there will be an October issue.
Excellent. We'll talk to you then.
Okay.
Now, once again, I want to thank Chris Colby for taking time to talk to us. If you'd like to receive a free copy of the current issue of Brew Your Own magazine, click on the BYO ad on basicbrewing.com. It's a great magazine. I subscribe to it myself. If you decide to subscribe after reading that free issue that you get from clicking on the ad on our site, you'll be helping to support this podcast. So you're doing two good things. You're rewarding yourself with a good magazine, and you're helping us out with the podcast support. So thanks very much to everybody who's already done that. It helps. It definitely helps. Next week, I hope to have an interview with Bob Hansen from Breese Malt and Ingredients Company on brewing high-gravity beers. Bob was one who I missed at the conference in Orlando, so it'll be good to catch up with him. If all goes well, we will talk to him next week. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say hey, write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from, and while you're on our site, you can check out our online shop where you can find all your wardrobe needs, as long as all you need is a T-shirt. Pants, not so much. You can also find great pricing on our DVDs and our ever-popular combo deal to save you even more. In our first DVD, Introduction to Extract Home Brewing, we walk you through the extract brewing process, step-by-step from boiling to bottling. And in Basic Brewing, Stepping into All Grain, we take you through the all-grain process, from milling your grain to collecting your wort. It's easy once you know how, and we tell you how. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com, and if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it online from us, and I'll pack it up myself. That's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.